What I've got here is a belt that's a bit undersized, so you can see the stress. I've enabled the strain map, so you can see it's tight around the avatar, but there's still this gap between the skin and the material. That's caused by the skin offset setting in the property of the avatar. By default in Material Designer it's set to 3mm. If I export the belt with a 3mm offset, and then import it into Daz, you can see that gap again still around the avatar. I'm just going to transfer that to the 8.1 female just to make sure that the morphs are carried across. And now I'm going to convert the belt into a dynamic object. Oops. So it's a dynamic surface. I'm just going to change some of the properties just to help it animate this better. Now if I simulate that from the just in the A pose, I won't do anything fancy. Simulate that, you'll see that because it's oversized, it's falling down the avatar. So even though in Material Designer it was clearly a tight belt, once you put it into Daz Studio with that offset, it's become very loose. You can get around this if you've got existing clothing. If you change the expansion ratio of the materials or the surfaces, so I put it to 95%. When you simulate that, it contracts around the avatar a little bit, pulls tight, but obviously you lose your dimensions a little bit. The belt's no longer as tall as it was, but it doesn't slip down the waist. This can work for some items of clothing. You might just tighten up the belt or tighten up the cuffs or tighten up the collar just to make sure that the fabric stays in place, you know, the item of clothing doesn't fall down the body. A better way to do it, I think, is if you go to your Material Designer and change the skin offset to say 0, you can see that gap has gone. It's got the same tightness as it did before, but it hasn't left that gap between the avatar and the material. And if I export that, call it belt 0. If I put this into Daz Studio, just hide the old one. You can see that's already looking tighter. And if I change that to a dynamic surface. Set those stiffness values the same. And then simulate that. So it's moved a little bit, but it's much better. You can correct for that a little bit by changing the friction. If I change the friction from its default of 0.4 to 0.8, it's not going quite so far. And you can still contract, but so you might only need to go down, say, 98%. Simulate that. Much less movement and not as much distortion. Might go in 99%. There you go, 99%. If you compare that to the original belt, let's just hide this one, animate the belt with the offset again. So that one is, oops, currently contracted to 95%. If we're back to 99, same as the other one, and simulate it. Let's put the friction the same as well, just so I'm comparing like for like. So that's contracted to 99% and a friction of 0.8 with an offset on the avatar. And you compare that to the belt with no offset, you can see it's an improvement. What I'm doing here is I'm going to assign different fabrics to different parts of the clothing in Material Designer. What you'll find is this gives you a way of controlling dForce a little bit easier. On this one I've got a belt. I'm just going to loosen that off a little bit. There we go, so it's a bit greener. So there's a belt. I've kept the 0 offset on the avatar as I did in the previous example, but just loosened off the belt a little bit. Now, although I'm going to make these out of the same fabric in the final render, it's quite useful to assign them to a new fabric. So if I call that one the belt, I can do the body. Where this is useful is when you export this as an FBX. And then bring that through to Daz. transform that, transfer that to the avatar again. Now I have loosened off the belt in this one, so if I just change my surface values, oops, gotta convert to a dynamic object first. Let's change the stiffness again, same as before. Simulate that. The weight of the body of the skirt is pulling the belt a lot further down. Now I have loosened off the belt, but because the tension's gone from that a bit, it's less distorted. But it's still slipping down the avatar a little bit. If you want to fix something in place, I mean in real life you'd expect a belt to hold the skirt up, and you can see that the separate surface materials from Material Designer, from Marvelous Designer, have come across as separate surfaces here. So if I go to the belt, I could change the dynamic strength of the belt to 0, and when you simulate that, the belt won't move under dForce, but the skirt will. I could have done this with a weight map against the dForce, but that's a simple way of doing it. Just turn the dynamic strength down to 0. If I change it to say 0.5, dForce will still act upon it, but not so strong. So that's how you might keep something in position. I just let's apply a pose to that. Looks safe. And simulate that from the start position. I animated okay, although the hand has pressed a bit too close. It's probably on my simulation settings, quality. Collision is set to better. If I set it to best, it may simulate better than that. Takes a little bit longer. So there's a skirt. If I just apply a smoothing modifier to that. There you go. It should stop it colliding with the skin a little bit. And if we go back to the belt, just to turn that dynamic strength back up again to default, you'll see the difference that that's made, hopefully. Yeah, that skirt slipped too far. Now there is an alternative to using dForce dynamic strength, which is if I go and create a modifier weight node against the skirt, I can pick the tool settings, make sure I'm in geometry editor, and there you see the surfaces. I've got a belt, and I can select the belt all in one go there. I'll go to the weight editor and add a map. I can edit the weight, fill the selected area with 0, and when that simulates, you'll see that the belt will not be affected by dForce. It's the same as the dynamic strength, but it's using a map rather than the surfaces themselves. So if you've only got a single surface for the belt and the skirt, you could, in theory, select the polygons you don't want to move, but by having them as separate surfaces, it's made the selection process a lot simpler. Sometimes you might have a pose where you're leaning against another object, some kind of furniture, or in this case a 1 meter cube, and you can see that the dress is as a conforming object, it's just going to intersect the cube. What we really want it to do is to drape around the cube. If you simulate this, the A pose position is actually intersecting the cube already, so you can see that the simulation is, well, it's catching the material on the cube on this one. This is a longer skirt with cut sides just to allow a bit more movement. But you can see it's really not coping with that very well. I'll just let it play to the end so we can see the final result on that. This skirt again has got the dynamic strength of the belt set as 0.2 on this one. The stiffness values are put to 0.55 and 0.05, the same as I did with the other skirts. So all the same parameters on the materials, but obviously it's not doing so well on the dForce on that one. When objects intersect on dForce, it tends not to make them collide properly. a way around it on this one would be to use a timeline to do the simulation. So what we can do is put the avatar into the pose and then slide it into position. Hopefully this will make the skirt drape around the cube. So if I just put up the timeline, now final position is over there, and I'm just going to set a key, make sure I've got the avatar selected, and set a key on that position. Now if I go back to the start of this 30 frame animation and move the avatar across to there and set another keyframe, what this does is across the animation the avatar slides onto the seating. What I'll probably do actually is just raise it up a little bit as well. Just give it a bit of clearance. Just set the key again so that from the start to the end sort of slides down in position like that. Now when you do your simulation, you want to simulate it to use the timeline. Now what this is going to do is, because I'm starting from the memorized pose, it should put it into the pose first and then generate the timeline. So we'll go back to the start again. Now if I simulate that, so you're in the A pose, it's going from the memorized position hasn't started executing the timeline yet. It's going to go into the position first. And because we're not intersecting the cube at this point, the cloth is draping correctly across the avatar. Now what's interesting with this one as well, you'll see the hand goes through the leg. Sometimes that can cause an explosion, so it might be worth also moving the hand. So now it's finished doing the position change. It starts moving the character across the timeline. And the skirt should drape across the cube as it moves into position. So remember, we're moving this across and down slightly, so it's got a bit of clearance to start with. Let's see how that's done. So you see the skirt has gone around the cube a bit. It's probably not perfect. If I'd changed the number of subframes or the number of iterations, it would have tried to do that simulation a bit more accurately around the cube, but for the sake of that it's fine. One issue there is a hand, you can see. A way around that is if I go back to, say, a midpoint of the animation. Let's pick her arm and bend it out of the way, and then add that key point just to the arm. What you'll see is, oops, need to bend it there as well. She'll move into that position, and as she slides across, the hand should come down. No, because I've done something wrong. Let's just undo what I've done. Right. So make sure I'm at the end position. 24.55. At the end position, 24.55. Key that frame. Make sure I'm at the start frame and key that frame. Right, so I've got key points for the start frame, a middle frame, and then as it comes down towards the end frame. That should stop the arm intersecting the skirt. I'm going to up the number of frames per second as well, just to try and get that skirt a bit more accurate against the cube. Simulate that. It's taking a bit longer this time because it's doing a bit more thinking and calculating. So it's going to move the avatar into that position with the hand raised. Now the arm should clear the leg this time. And it won't pass through the skirt. An alternative method you can do is, if you don't want to go messing about with your pose, to make your arm pass around objects. You could turn off the visibility of the hand to dForce so that it gets completely ignored. But it's not necessary now. I've put this hand in a higher position. So it's just coming up to the end of the memorized pose, the hand raised, and now it'll begin executing along the timeline. As it reaches the key point in frame 12 of this, so we're on 4, 5, when it gets to 12 you'll see the hand will start moving down into its final position. So on these last half of the frames you'll see the arm come down and touch the cube. So there's the figure and the skirt draped across. No intersection, well, very little intersection, or not enough to worry about for the render. And of course you've got, if you want to analyse where you may have gone wrong on your pose, I may have needed to lift the arm up more at that point. It only just clears the skirt during the initial pose.